Hey there, I'm Lindsay Dreyer, host of the Joyfulpreneur podcast, where I share tips, tricks, and strategies to help women entrepreneurs maximize joy and freedom in their lives and businesses. Let's dive into today's episode.
Have you ever wondered what it takes to start a podcast? You are in for a treat today. I have Brittany Rincon with Hello Podcast Media, and she is going to dive into podcasting made easy. After this episode, you are going to have everything you need to get your podcast launched and listened to.
Brittany, I would love to start with how you got into podcasting.
Yes. So actually a couple of years ago, I want to say it was 2020, it was during the pandemic. I was listening to a million podcasts, as everyone kind of was during that time. And I would go on a lot of walks with my son. And I just had this like epiphany. And I thought to myself, I could totally do this. Like, it doesn't seem that hard. I could figure this out. I mean, there's YouTube and like, I know some people, let me just see how I could put this together. And when I get an idea, I like dive like really deep into the rabbit hole of like research. And I found a host who I was really connected with, and I loved her show. And she actually helped me produce my first show. So she walked me through the process. And a few weeks later, I started my very first podcast, which was the Teacher Leader podcast, because my background actually is in education. And that quickly kind of took off. I would say I joined a network at that time, and I had a lot of people sending me messages like, how did you do this? Like, I see you doing like speaking gigs and I see you on different shows. I want to do that too. Like, how do I do it? So then I started helping people really informally, just on Zoom, like do this, try this. And that kind of quickly grew into Hello Podcast Media, which is my business today, where we do full production for online entrepreneurs. We work with women who have their own businesses, whether that's through coaching, consulting, product-based businesses, authors, speakers, right? We kind of have a little bit of everything. And it's just been a really fun journey to go from like, I'm going to start a podcast to like, now I'm managing shows.
That's so cool. And also can go to show you can pivot your career at any time in your life.
Oh yeah. I love, people ask me all the time, like, oh, do you have a background in like audio engineering or like in marketing? And I say, no, I was a teacher for 10 years, but that goes to show like a teacher can do anything.
Honestly, teachers are the heroes of the world. So I believe that they can do anything. So I am going to guess that you believe podcasting should be at the center of people's marketing as an entrepreneur. So tell me about the marketing strategy or why you believe that podcasting can be such a powerful marketing vehicle for entrepreneurs.
I think podcasting does so well is because people can listen to someone else's voice. Like, you can't hire someone else to pretend to be you in this space, even though like AI is like going in a whole nother direction lately, but people get to like hear your voice, they hear your story, they hear your jokes, your tone, your accent. They just get to know you on a deeper level than if they were just reading a blog, and I think that we were really missing that piece, that connection piece, like on social media, in shorter videos. People always say like when they're listening to podcasts, they feel like they could be more vulnerable. It's like just a longer, more raw type of medium. And people have this ability to be very vulnerable in a podcast that you won't see, if they're getting very dolled up and lights and everything for a YouTube video. There's just something about it that still feels very homey, very like, we're going to just sit down and have a conversation. And I think when you start from that place, from that vulnerability, and you build your marketing around that, people really get to know you and they can learn more about you and feel that connection.
So it's a really authentic way to let people into who you are as a person, it sounds like.
Yeah. And it's a great way for you to get to know other people because like podcasting really brings people together. You're, like your guests on other shows or vice versa. And you get to meet people that you wouldn't normally meet. And it just grows your network in that way, but also gives you a chance to have very, very like deep conversations. Like I always say, like, you just can't Google these answers. You have to have like a full conversation to really answer some of these like life questions.
You just explained why I love having a podcast. It's the deep connections with new people and really not talking about surface stuff. Like you get to dive in deep to interesting topics and also just people's lives and their life experiences. So I am 100% on board. Going back to the intimacy and like building intimate connections with people is funny. My husband actually can't listen to my podcast because he said it's so awkward for him.
I think my husband listened to like one episode, like to be supportive, you know, and then he doesn't listen to podcasts at all. He's like, I don't know what to do with this now. Like, I think I'm following you. I'm not sure, you know, he's like, I listen to like car shows and like you, and that's the only thing in his life.
So we're talking about how podcasting does not have to be super complicated. So let's break it down in really simple form. So we have somebody, they want to start a podcast. Where do they start?
Yes. I think there's this idea that, you know, I want to start a podcast and I'm going to go to Google and YouTube and I'm going to buy a microphone and that's it. And like, it's just going to happen. And I think people kind of start in the wrong place, right? They start with the microphone. They start kind of like Googling all the tech behind it and how to actually do it. And they miss the whole part where I always start with my clients, which is like, why?
Guilty.
Why? Yes. Oh, me too. Please. My first thing was like, how do I start a podcast? And like, which is the best microphone on my budget, you know? And then, you know, next thing you know, I have a million different gadgets and things, but people miss the why. And I think that especially today, you really need to know why you're starting a show. It's time consuming. It can be easy, but it's still going to be a chunk of your time like any other type of long form marketing and content. So why are you starting the show? Who is going to be your listener? And what's going to take them from listener to client or listener to customer? Because there has to be that journey. And if you're starting a podcast because it's a hobby and that's great, and you just want to like talk about TV shows or whatever, that's fine. But you still have to think about what their journey is, because they're going to go from a listener to some type of supporter, whether that's on social media, your email list, right? And I think that's the part that people really miss. And that's the first part that you have to think about is, what is that whole process going to look like for the people who tune in, and why me? And I always say, like, everyone can start a podcast. Like, everyone has their own unique special sauce that makes what they're saying special and different. But you really need to like kind of hone in and have that like deep conversation with yourself and get down to like those details in order for it to be successful. And what successful looks like in podcasting is different for every single person. It's not just about download numbers.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the success metrics that you think, what should people consider success in terms of a podcast?
I think it really depends on your business model. So for example, I'm a podcast producer. So I have a podcast and it's really to help people learn about the industry, learn about strategies, right? And the people who are listening, I want them to work with me. So success for me is, are they listening to my show and then booking a call? Mm-hmm. And I mean, I've had people like book a call and say, I found your website, I found your podcast, I listened to all the episodes, and like I knew I wanted to work with you. Like that's success for my business and my structure. But I have clients who have a product-based business, and success for them is, are people then buying the product? Are they joining the community? Are they taking the next steps that you want them to? And we do that. We look at that in different ways, right? We'll look at click rates and conversions and things like that. And we kind of look at it that way. So it really depends on your industry and what you're hoping for them to do at the end. I think one big misconception that I see a lot too is like, oh, I'm going to send them to my email list, but then they don't actually send out any emails, or they don't sell in their emails. So they're like, okay, I'm getting people on my email list, but my podcast still isn't producing any revenue. And that's why, like, that's that stop in the customer journey and the experience that people miss.
So they really have to think about it as a marketing funnel. It has to be a part of their client journey from getting them to whatever you want to get them to.
Mm-hmm. And even if like, I work with people too who like don't have a full business where they're offering services, but they are producing revenue from their show because they have a way of their community just to support the show, right? So whether that's through a Patreon or a different platform or some type of like membership, you do need to think about, why are they doing that? What are they going to get out of it? And how can they support the show? And it could still be successful in those ways, in those like terms as well.
Okay. In terms of format, do you have an opinion on solo episodes versus guest interview episodes?
I think in the beginning, it's very like, I'm going to just throw spaghetti at the wall and see what works. And because every single person is different, it depends on your audience. So one thing you could do is you can kind of do a little bit of both and then look at your download numbers in 3 months and see what is performing well. Because some people, their audience loves solo episodes, and for others, they only love interviews. And you want to look at those numbers and then make more of what people are listening to. And not necessarily to like just change your philosophy and like why you started the show, but you do want to think about like, what are the numbers telling you? Mm-hmm. Is it the titles? Is it the guests? Are your guests promoting your show? Is that why those are doing, well? And another thing you could do too is once you've built a community, you can actually ask them like, what content are you tuning in for? Why are you listening week after week? Like, what are the episodes that you're really enjoying? And again, making more of what's working.
That makes so much sense. So I love that you're basically giving people permission to just experiment when you're first starting, is that you're really just putting something out there and then seeing how everyone responds to it and then making decisions from there.
Yes, I think, and 3 months is like a good amount of time where you can then start making tweaks in the very, very beginning. Like, especially if you're someone who doesn't have like a really huge following and you're just starting out and you're seeing like these lower numbers like come in, it's pretty average. Like, I think people don't realize like there's hundreds and thousands of podcasts and like the average podcast gets 100, 150 downloads per episode, right? Like, we only see what we see on social media with these huge numbers, but the reality is a lot of them are really in that average zone. And I know people who make more money with lower download numbers than people who are in the thousands, per episode. So it's about how is your business structured? How is the format of your show structured that's really taking people through that journey?
In terms of content, let's talk about solo episodes and building your authority. Do you have any advice around that for someone who's just starting?
I think it goes back to, why are you making your show and what do you want to be known for? I think sometimes people are like, I want to start a podcast because, one, I'm seeing it a lot and I think that's the next step for me, because that does happen. I'll hop on calls with people and they're like, well, everyone has a show and it looks like a lot of fun and I want to do it too. I have told people, hey, I would love to help you, but like, how is this adding value to your business? Like, are we going to be able to use this to help grow it? And if they're not sure, then they're probably just not ready to work with me at that point in time. And they kind of have to answer that question. So really understanding, what is it that you want to be known for? One step that I like to tell people is like, well, what are your content pillars? Like, what are you going to be saying over and over again? What are you going to be known for? For me, it's podcasting. So I talk about podcasting marketing. I talk about tech and equipment and tips and tricks, right? And I talk about kind of content strategy in general and how to repurpose it and put it on social media, things like that, and really monetize it. So like, those are the pillars of my show. And that's really what I talk about. And then I might throw in more personal things as well, because I do want people to get to know me and not just hear me talk about microphones.
Right.
But it's more sprinkled in because I know that people tuning in, that's what they're here for. And that's what I want to then push them to, is here are the products that I sell that can help you get to that end result.
So once the train's left the station and you're past that 3-month mark and you've done your experimentation, you're starting to get your feet under you, do you have an example of a client or someone, maybe even yourself, where you've made a successful pivot? Because I feel like people start and then they realize, oh, shoot, I need to kind of switch this up. Like, do you have any advice once you get to that point of, I need to pivot?
Yeah, I think sometimes even with like your business too, and that idea, like you change your mind and evolution is okay and no one's going to be upset, And one question that I get a lot is, should I start a brand new show? Like, should I get a different RSS feed, have a whole new account? I'm completely changing the direction of my show. Like, what do I do? And like, my advice is always no.
That sounds like a ton of work. Yeah. I'm like, no, don't do it.
I'm like, don't do it. You've worked so hard to build this audience. And what I recommend is you can change the name of the show. You can change your cover art. And you can make an episode and say like, look, this is the direction that this show is going in. I would love for you to stay, and stick with me through this journey. Like, I'm evolving, we all evolve, and let's see where this takes us. And it's totally okay to change your mind and pivot. And like, you don't have to, I think people think it's really permanent, it's like their domain. They're like, I've already picked this name, I can't change it, but you can totally change it. And most of the time people really actually appreciate learning about the journey and understanding why you made that change. And it also makes you feel more approachable and, human. And that's also great too.
Not a perfect robot. Those don't exist.
No.
Sorry.
No, I mean, I've had more than one show myself, like I used to talk about teacher leadership and now I talk about podcasting. And I actually do have people who used to listen to me in my teacher mode who still listen to me in my podcast mode because they're curious about how I made that change. So it really depends on, like where you're going and why. Mm-hmm. The one thing I will say is if you are going to pivot, again, understanding why are you pivoting? Why is your messaging changing? And is the new version of your show going to be something that people will be like really clear with your messaging? Like your new podcast name, is it going to be something that's searchable and easy to understand? When I get to if I found you randomly, will I know what your show is for and if it's for me or not just by looking at the cover art? Things like that. Like that's important to know too.
It feels like there's so much to think about. You actually have to think about this kind of stuff.
I feel like I'm making it not sound as easy as it is, but I swear it is, because you really just have to kind of put it out there. People get really scared and stuck in like the logistics of it, but you really can just start it and then make changes as you go. It doesn't always have to come out. It's not going to come out perfect, never in a million years, but just starting it and seeing what works, and it could grow and evolve, and that's okay.
You are making this seem simple, because really what it is like you just have to have the strategy and all of that squared away and then just record it and then upload it. It really isn't, you don't have to be a pro editor. You don't have to make sure the sound quality is the most perfect. Like you can say and ah, it's okay. So I think that it's really, it can be as complicated as you want it to be. Mm-hmm. So since we're talking about keeping it super simple today, sorry, I went down a little rabbit hole myself, but I find this stuff very fascinating. What is the minimum equipment, the minimum tech that somebody would need to get started?
I would say there's this like idea that you don't need a microphone, and you actually do. And I don't mean like an expensive microphone. Like you can definitely go on Amazon and pick up something that's really affordable, but audio quality is important because, like I've had to edit episodes where the audio quality isn't great. And it's really hard to kind of push past that and listen to the content and hear what they're actually saying when you're just like kind of stuck in that like staticky type of thing. So like a microphone is really important. Headphones are really important if you're interviewing guests, but if you're doing solo episodes, you don't need headphones. You just really, really need them if you have a guest on, because you don't want to hear them through your computer, which then picks up onto your microphone. And then you will need some type of editor. And I think even in the last 2 years, there have been so many amazing like tech things to come out. So Descript is a really great user-friendly platform that you could record right into, and then it transcribes what you say into like a Google Doc, and you can just edit it like you edit a Google Doc. And so like if you're not really techie and you don't want to learn how to edit audio like waves and you're just like, that's not for me, that's a great place to start. Like I have clients who that's what they do. They send me the audio from Descript and I kind of clean it up a little bit. But if she ever really wanted to take it over, she could, in kind of learning really simple ways. One thing that, especially if you're just starting out and like, you're like, I don't have the budget for an editor, you can hire someone just to produce your intro and your outro and maybe a commercial and have those files ready to go so that you can then move forward and produce your own show moving forward and just adding in those clips when necessary.
Yes. Fiverr, Upwork, all of those. They're so great for the intro, outro. I love Audacity. Like that is like my favorite recording. It's so easy.
Audacity's good, and GarageBand. So if you have a Mac, like GarageBand's really good. It's free, comes on your computer already. Like even in like this space, you hear all these different tools, and I like to play around and try them all. But at the end of the day, they all do the same thing. Like especially for what we're doing, like the types of show we're producing, we don't need this to sound like, an NPR narrative podcast.
Although you do, Brittany.
I mean, I like little bells and whistles, I'm not going to lie.
So in terms of software for actually publishing and syndicating the podcast, what options do you feel like are worth taking a look at?
Yeah. So any type of host site that you need to actually, how I like to explain it is like, you have a file when you're done, right? You have this audio file. It's usually like an MP3 file or a WAV file, and you need to put it onto a host site so that it then goes onto every player out there, because you do not want to do that manually. Some people always ask me like, can I host my show on my website? And I say no. I mean, you could, but I say no because it takes up, audio files are large and they take up a lot of space on your website, and it actually will slow down your website. So I do not recommend that. And there are a lot of affordable platforms out there. So Buzzsprout is one that I recommend and use with a lot of clients. Libsyn is another one that's been around for a really, really long time. And honestly, like every day new ones pop up. If you want to do a private podcast, so that's one that's not searchable on Google or Spotify, Hello Audio is a great platform to put out that type of content.
Awesome. All right. So we've covered strategy, your why. Why are you doing this? First step. We covered technology, equipment, software, all that good stuff. So now you have your first episode out, or your first couple of episodes. How do you get listeners?
Oh my goodness. I think people are like, I took so much time to produce this. Like, I'm tired. I'm going to take a break. Like,
right?
It's out there, And it's like, I know, I'm so sorry, but you really have to talk about your show. Podcasting is not something that's searchable. It's not something that will pop up like a YouTube video, that type of thing, or a blog. So it does take a lot of work to grow a podcast. And things that I always recommend are doing podcast swaps with someone else in your niche or in something similar, being a guest on someone else's show and talking about your podcast, finding more creative ways of really putting it out there into the world, because you want to get in front of people who are already listeners. That's why social media is really hard to grow a podcast, because just because I'm on Instagram doesn't mean I want to listen to a podcast. So when you're thinking about, the other question too is, why do you want to grow? Because another thing I like to tell people is, okay, let's say you have 25 downloads, right? You're just starting out and they're upset about that. I'm like, if you were in front of 25 people right now, and you could convert just a few of them, wouldn't that make the biggest difference in your business tomorrow? And, the answer is usually yes, of course, right? Because the conversion rates on podcasts are higher than almost any other marketing platform. So that's the way you really have to reframe it. If you're going to grow it, you have to make sure you know why you want to grow it. Because the answer is always like, oh, well, I want to sell ads. Okay, but industry standards are not really high for ads. Like, you can make way more money selling your own services and your own products. So thinking about that too, when you're thinking about like, why do you want to grow the show? Is it actually going to be the thing that moves the needle in your business?
So what repurposing, or how do you repurpose your podcast into marketing pieces? And which ones do you think are the best bang for your buck?
Oh, I love this question. Okay. So what I always recommend is, once you have your show, you definitely want to transcribe it. And there's so many great AI tools out there now. So ChatGPT right now is still free. I'm sure that's going to change soon. But I take a transcript, I put it in there, and I say, write a blog with, X amount of words with, bullets and blah, blah, blah. And it will spit me out an amazing blog post, right? So now you have your podcast episode, you have a blog that's on your website that you can have lots of SEO keywords in that makes it really searchable. And that's the first thing that I always recommend, making sure that you have it on your website as a blog post attached to your audio. Then the next place I would say is in your email. Like, share it out with your email list that you have created this amazing episode. Here are a couple of things you're going to learn. Tune in to hear like my 3 tips on X. After you've done that, the next thing I'd like to recommend too is repurposing it into, I like video. I think video is just performing really well on social media. Like, if you're going to use it, put it out there as a reel or as, a story of some kind with like a clip, an audio clip. And then carousels are also really important. Like, what were the 3 things that I would take away from this episode about podcasting made easy and making a carousel with that. Because the thing that I see is people have a great podcast episode and then they create a completely different strategy for their social media marketing. And they're exhausted, and they should be exhausted because they're like doing two completely different things. And your one episode can turn into email, blog, 3 reels, 2 carousels, a couple of posts, and it could really just stretch that way so that you're really saying the same thing, just in different mediums.
That sounds like a lot of work. So that's when we need to hire you. And, but okay. So as someone who's just starting out, they probably are still figuring out if this is something they want to do long-term. They're doing all the things and they're realizing that maybe a weekly episode is not for them. So is it better to have quality or quantity?
Always quality.
Okay.
Always quality. Like you can put out 2 really good podcast episodes a month, let's say, and that could perform just as well if you're doing weekly. Like the reason people will do weekly is because they think they have to, because everyone else does, right? And there are people who put out even more than 1 episode a week, right? And what does that do? That doubles your download numbers, especially if you have a really active community. And if that's your goal, right? Because you want to then go and find sponsors and ads because that's the direction of your business, and that makes sense. But if the direction of your business is to grow more, to have more clients or to have more customers, then you really need to think about like what's going to make the most sense. There's people who even just put out like 1 episode a month, right? As long as their audience is aware of their schedule and it makes sense, then I always say like, do what works best for you. And like, even when I recommended like, you could turn 1 show into all this content. If you're already producing that content, then yes, reuse the podcast episode to create that content. Don't make it completely separate from your podcast.
So you could realistically take 1 episode a month and make that your month content, because those episodes have so much meat in them that it could be like your whole social media. This is the theme for the month that revolves around this podcast episode.
Mm-hmm. And another thing I see too is their episode is like something that they're already doing. So it could just be like, tune in to hear, when I talked to my community on IG and they took the audio off of an IG live and they're repurposing that. Or it was like a client call that they had and the client was okay with it being on air, right? And they're reusing that as well. And then another thing too, like podcast swaps are really popular. Like let's say you did 2 episodes a month and then those other 2 episodes with someone else's show. Mm-hmm. That's you putting out content on your own RSS feed and, increasing your own download numbers with someone else's content, and you're both winning.
That's awesome. So yeah, think outside the box in terms of collaboration and all of that. Do you feel like guest podcasting is worthwhile? And what is your advice for pitching if you are new to podcasting?
I think the best thing to do is really start with relationships. Like if you know someone already who has a show, kind of starting from there, like there's just been something that triggers a conversation when you say like, I have a podcast and I would love for you to be on it because I've been following you for a while. And it has gotten me in front of people who I really never would have been able to talk to because I'm giving them this like value, this like place to start. And now I get to talk to this person who I'm like really interested in working with. And it just opens the door. It like allows you a foot in to then take that guest podcast and turn it into another collaboration in the future or something else, right? So I would say it's much, much easier to get guests on your show than it is to be a guest, especially, I would say in the last year, it's been definitely more difficult because like there are just a lot of different podcasts. I mean, a lot of Facebook groups that are like, podcast swaps and things like that. So you just want to be really, really intentional and do your research, and you want to be on the right show. Because if you're going to be a guest on the show, you have to think about, well, what are you going to say? And how are you going to then send people back to you? And is this your audience or is it not, right? Like what's going to be the end result of it?
Any other final tips for making podcasting easy?
I think the first tip is like, just hop on a mic and hit record and see what happens, because you're going to be really awkward in the beginning. I remember the first time I tried it, I said, oh my God, this is so hard. Like I always thought of myself as a talker. Like blogging was never my thing. YouTube seemed really challenging for me. I was like, I can do this. I can just like talk. I talk all the time, you know? And it's really hard to, one, get used to hearing the sound of your own voice. And then two, getting used to just sounding really natural when you're reading off of like a script. Mm-hmm. And I do recommend starting off with some type of script, not like word for word, but something that really organizes your thoughts so that you know what you're going to say, and then practice it, you know, like record yourself a little bit, hear it back. And then after a few times, like you really do get in the groove of it. And then another thing you could also do is just have someone else listen to it and have like a fresh perspective and say like, hey, what do you think of this episode? Especially when you're first starting out before you publish it.
Awesome. Tell us where we can find you.
Yes. So you can find me on my website, hellopodcastmedia.com. And you could also find me on Instagram. I am in there a lot. I am at Britt, B-R-I-T-T, Rincon, R-I-N-C-O-N, which is my name. I'm always in there answering a lot of like podcasting questions. So if you're like just starting out and you're like, I'm not sure if this is right, like we do a lot of audits for people who are just starting out. Like they're like, I would love to have a producer one day, right? But it's just not in the cards right now. So like, can you like listen to my show and make sure I'm like on the right path? And we do a lot of those. So those are, you could find those on my website. And I love helping people kind of navigate this space, especially when they're new.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of your knowledge today. I feel like this is such a great place for anyone who's podcast curious or maybe has just gotten into the game.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Joyfulpreneur podcast. Remember to check the show notes for all the links and resources mentioned in this episode. Your reviews also mean the world to me. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Until next time, stay joyful.